Today I'm gonna present this tutorial about the economics of quantitative testing. Let me start from the example, main motivation, which will guide some of our discussion. Suppose that we got a drug company, and the drug company is interested in testing the efficacy of a drug in a clinic. And for instance, there may be a regulator, let's say FDA, that based on the result of this clinical trial may decide whether to approve it. So first of all, the first question which arises is, okay, what's the null hypothesis of this? The second question is, okay, then we would like to collect the sample and test the null hypothesis of interest to test the efficacy of the drug. Now, downstream, there are lots of other questions that we can test. So what's the test of this construct? When actually do we want to reject the given null hypothesis that we posed? And how do we think about the cost and benefit of testing the drug itself? So let's just step back a little bit and let's think a little bit about history, not going too far back in time, but still relatively far back in time. So let's start from what Fisher was thinking about testing. And so Fisher will argue, at least I think will argue to say, okay, well, maybe what we can do is to test the effect of whether the drug has some effect across all the questions in our experiment. So testing a sort of a shot.
Sorry, so you have Q&A activated, so it's up to you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's just me saying that.
Okay.
All wants to make questions.
Okay, perfect.
I'll pass them to you to monitor that.
Okay. By the way, yeah, questions during the talk. And so what we will do is that we will test this null hypothesis and test whether there is any effect. And for instance, report the p-value as a form of information about the efficacy of the drug itself. Let's see if this will work. It's working. Okay. Now, Neyman and Persson, what they thought is that they were kind of, at least in their words, they were kind of formalizing a little bit more the framework of Fisher, and so they would say, well, what we can test is some parameter of the model, for instance, the effect on the mean, if we, for instance, specify the likelihood function. And so we can think about a null hypothesis where there is an effect on the mean, an alternative hypothesis where there is no effect on the mean, taking a superpopulation perspective. And then we can think about constructing an acceptance and rejection region. And so having two clear decisions to make. Either we accept the null hypothesis or we reject the null hypothesis, and so we embrace the alternative hypothesis. And so all builds on what they call this fundamental lemma, for which we can think about some form of optimal testing which maximize power given control on type 1 error, so given control on the probability on rejecting the null when this is true. And so there is some form of clash between these two approaches, because on one side we have Fisher, which really has more like an inductive type procedure, saying, well, let's just look at the data and let's see if the data tell us that there's any evidence of some effect. And a deductive procedure, which is to say, well, let's posit a model in the first place, and then let's try to test the effect on this model, taking the superpopulation. So what is the current practice today? So this is a quote from Romano and Lehmann, and so the quote says, this customary effort to assign a bound on the probability of incorrectly rejecting the null hypothesis by 0 when it is true, and attempt to minimize the other probability subject to this condition. So what we see in practice is a form of lexicographic preferences in the way we conduct hypothesis tests. So we first really care about size control, and now given size control, we want to maximize power. And so this leads us to all sorts of questions. So first of all, why do we have these preferences, and how do we relate these to our decision power? And then if we think about size control, how do we think about choice of type 1 error in the first place? And even more difficult is what if we have multiple hypotheses that we want to test? So again, this is a quote in which the argument that is made is that oftentimes we do see a given level of control, say 1% in this example, but this is often too stringent, and it is the business of the experiment to choose a proper level of in any particular case, remembering that the fewer the errors and the more the risk of the other. So basically, there is a trade-off in the choice of type 1 error. So before we dive into some details, just returning to our to a very illustrative example to what is practice if we think about clinical trials. If we think about clinical trials, the practice is typically to have a size, a type 1 error control of 2.5% for phase 3 trials, so quite stringent. And then there is a conditional power, which really means having a sample size sufficiently large, which is around 90% for phase 3 trials. And then we can think about all sorts of costs that are also related to phase 3 trials. So there are costs, for instance, to recruit people in the experiment. There is also some time dimension. So, for instance, the trial may take up to 3 years.
Sorry, none of these are FDA rules, right? This is just
This is just observational, yes. This is just observational, but FDA does prescribe size control around 2.5%, at least in the guidelines. And then you can think about all sorts of costs which are related to the trials. Okay. So let's start from the single hypothesis testing procedure. And so the outline of this part is going to be first to review a little bit the framework, the hypothesis testing framework, to think about this as a game against nature, to think about different decision criteria, so min-max, min-max regret, Bayesian and decision rule, think about the formalization in a game theoretic framework, and then I'm going to connect to a slightly different problem, which is about the optimal population. Okay, so consider data, and this data may be drawn from some density, which is parameterized by given parameters data. So we can think about data, for instance, the mean of our distribution. So we're interested in some null hypothesis that we can posit by saying, well, our parameter data is in some parameter space theta 0, and the alternative hypothesis will state that the parameter data is in the space. And so we can think about a test just as a map from the data to 0, 1. In principle, could be randomized. Let's consider no randomized tests for simplicity. So either accept or a reject. So what is the rejection region? The rejection region is going to be the region for which, given the data that you said, we're going to reject the null hypothesis. So a formal definition of type 1 and type 2 error, we can think about 2 different decisions. Either we choose the null hypothesis or we choose the alternative hypothesis, and for which we have a type 1 error, which is going to be that when H0 is true, we're going to choose the alternative, and type 2 error, that when H1 is true, we're going to choose the null hypothesis. So with this size, well, the size is just going to be the largest probability of rejection under the null, and so we want size typically to be controlled by alpha, and then power is just going to be the probability of rejection, and it's going to be a function itself of the parameters. So what do we want in practice? Well, in practice, what we do see is that we fix alpha to be 5%, and then we want sufficient power. Yes.
I mean, feel free to postpone all that, but
no.
I guess like there's, I mean, if you think about this decision problem, right, then there's actually already a lot of structure that's imposed here implicitly.
There is.
Where, I mean, there's 2 things you can think about as binary, right? One is the decision that's binary, and the other is like the state of the world is binary. And then the basic name appears and it's both, right? But the binary decision, I think, makes sense in a lot of cases where a binary state of the world doesn't.
Right, that's exactly. So this is why what I'm referring to this is really person about this testing protocol. Because indeed we think about everything to be binary, so we have basically have a null and an alternative, and also the decision itself is binary. This does not need to be the case. We can think about a framework where, for instance, you just report a set of statistics, and then people consider about the relevant parameters. Yeah. So for the moment, we just look at partially settings in number.
Well, I mean, you do write the hypothesis as composite here, right? The alternative.
Right. So for now.
But the loss function just depends on which one.
Right. So the loss function that I'm gonna characterize, that I'm gonna define, is just a loss function which on basically that one. Okay. So what are the desirable properties that we want to think of? So one property that, for instance, we may want is that the test is unbiased, which what this really means is that the power beta of theta is going to be at least as large as the size. Maybe we would like some consistent tests. So suppose that we collect data and we have a sequence of data generating process, each indexed by the sample size. Now we would like that as the sample size grow, power converges to 1. And maybe we would like something, we would like some test that in some sense is uniformly most powerful. So compared to other tests which control the same level alpha, then this test is going to be more powerful across all choice of parameters. And so these are just some definitions. So first question is, how do we choose the alpha test? And again, here we can just invoke the human person lemma. And so consider a simple null hypothesis where theta is less or equal than theta 0, and an alternative where theta is greater than theta 0. And now let's consider that this ratio between likelihood is monotonic for any theta 1 greater or equal than theta 0. And this typically obtained, for instance, for Gaussian models or for general. And we can take a test which is really take the form of a threshold, for which we are going to reject if x is greater than a given threshold x star, and we are not going to reject otherwise. And then we choose the threshold so to control the size, so to have type 1 error to be equal to 1. So if we do so, then we can show that this test is going to be uniformly most powerful. So this is what basically they refer to as fundamental lemma, because now we don't have really to make a choice in which alternative really we're interested in, even if, because we can take data under the alternative to take any one value. And really what only we have to do is that we have to impose type 1 error control. Now, given type 1 error control, we know how to construct some sort of test.
But which goes back to, sorry to
no, please, this is a good task. Yeah.
Because I mean, it's
Yeah.
obviously all very like standard assumptions, but the fact that you don't care about where you are in the alternative again hinges on the fact that your loss function doesn't depend on where you are in the alternative.
Right. So here,
So like if you think about the trade-off between
we are not even thinking about any loss function now. So that's the point. Is that so far there's no loss function in the background, and the only thing that we're saying, let's control size. We really take this axiomatic, this lexicographic preference of size. Let's just one size to be alpha, and now we're almost like done. And so this can be one motivation for what we are doing, for instance. But there's no loss functions. And so a simple example is a standard t-test. So for instance, if we have these x which are drawn Gaussian with a mean theta and variance 1, then what we're going to do is that we're just going to construct the t-test, which is obvious. Now, one caveat, and this is going to be relevant once we move away from single hypothesis testing, for instance, is that uniformly most powerful tests typically don't exist once we think about vector parameters. So this makes the choice quite hard once we start thinking about hypotheses.
One is a vector parameters, the other is the vector mixes. You were cheating a little bit because you just aggregated them in X bar.
That's exactly right. Yes, yes. So here I'm basically saying, well, I'll just take X bar and then I'm done. And that's it. Well, these are drawn from a Gaussian, so this is why I'm doing that. But that's exactly right. So these go back to like the Fisher criticism saying, well, you're actually posit a model in the first place once you do hypothesis testing. And I don't really think that's the right way to do it. But yeah. Okay, so this is what it is. There's no loss function, there's nothing. This is just size control for uniformly most powerful. So let's think about relating this problem to a decision problem. And so one way to think about this is that maybe we have two players, really 1.5. So one player is nature, and nature is going to choose distribution, and the other player is going to be the statistician. And now we're going to try to think about different loss function and how do we choose optimal testing protocols, given that, for instance, nature can play against us. So let's define our test to be just a decision function. For instance, should I approve the drug which the company is testing, or should I not? Now, for a given decision, we can define a loss function. And so this loss function is gonna be a function of our parameter theta and our decision. And then we can look at expected value of our loss function to be our objective. So now we're gonna integrate over the distribution of x. The distribution of x is gonna be parameterized by theta. So we have a model. So again, going back to Matt's point, we're gonna mostly focus to this binary decision and binary loss. So we're gonna have a binary decision, either I don't approve or I approve your drug, and then correspondingly, we're gonna have different loss function. So if I approve your drug, but the parameter is actually in the null space, I'm gonna pay a price of kappa, otherwise I'm gonna pay a price of 1. Okay, so let's try to think about different type of objective function. So the very first objective function may be, for instance, to say, okay, so I'm gonna pay a price kappa if theta is in theta 0, and I'm gonna pay a price 1 otherwise. So this is what I just described. And so how can we choose kappa that would justify what we see in practice, where size is 5%? So what we could do, we could say, well, we don't really know theta, so what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna look at the worst case loss function, and then I'm gonna minimize the worst case loss function, so I'm gonna assume termination is playing against it. So under some regularity condition, what we can show is that, okay, this worst case approach is gonna lead us to two different outcomes. So either we're gonna pay a price k, and then I'm gonna make it the most worst off I can. So I'm gonna look at the largest value of your test under the null hypothesis, and so I'm gonna force theta to be in the null space. And now what is this value? Well, typically it is less or equal than our size, so you can think about this component to be equal to our alpha. So let's take it this. Okay, so the other way I can screw you is instead say, well, I'm gonna pick theta not to be in the null space. So now what's the price that they're gonna pay? Well, now the price that they're gonna pay is gonna be 1 minus the smallest value that I can, the smallest expectation of this test once we're not in the null space. And typically we can think of this value taking value alpha as well. So what's the optimal thing that we would like to do if we can choose? So what we can do is that we can say, well, let me set alpha to be such that these two components are equal. And so if I set alpha such that these two components are equal, what this implies is that I want alpha to be 1 over kappa plus 1. And so if I want to motivate a test with alpha equal to 2.5%, as FDA would prescribe for phase 3 trials, then I need an asymmetry which is quite huge. I need kappa to be 0. So already here we can see that typically size control should make sense, but impose huge asymmetry on the corresponding loss function. Now, what's an issue with this loss function that you guys can see?
Back to the point, right? If you have like theta very close to 0, for instance, if the null is equal to 0, you don't really care. But that's
exactly right.
The worst case.
That's exactly right. So the value of theta does not enter here. It's just a loss which depends on whether theta is in theta 0 or is not. So something else that we can do is to try to incorporate the value of theta in the loss function itself. Okay, so how can we do that? Well, we can say, well, suppose that theta denotes the effect of our drug. So if theta denotes the effect of our drug, maybe our utility function is gonna be the treatment effect theta times whether we approve the drug. 5x. Okay, so let's think about the worst case scenario. What would be the phi which will maximize the worst case loss function in this setting? So if we think about the worst case scenario and we look just at the worst case of this objective function, then we always want to pick phi equal to 0, no matter. So the trivial decision is going to be the optimal decision. So this is quite disappointing. So what we can look instead is another notion of objective function, which is going to be min-max regret. So what we can say, well, let's not just directly look at this theta times p of x. We can look basically at the welfare of the optimal decision, the truly optimal decision, the oracle one, which is going to choose the to implement the policy whenever theta is positive, and then we're going to compare these to our utility function. So if we think about a minimax regret, and then we look at the expectation, Maskey in 2004, but this is also the effect for Maskey, recommend to use empirical Sassel rule, for which what we want to do is that we're going to say, well, our test function is just going to look at the empirical average of our data, and then it's going to choose to implement the policy whenever the empirical average is possible. So this is really a t-test with 50% significance level. So why is that the case? Well, it shows that it shows that if we look at the worst case expected loss function, now this worst case expected loss function is going to converge to 0 at a rate which is 1 over square root 10, when square root 10 is your sample size. And you cannot really improve this rate. And so this is the main motivation behind this empirical Sassel rule that Maskey suggests. Okay, so this really means that we're going to pick alpha to be 50% if we think about this as our main loss function. And this relates to this comment from 1945 saying it has perhaps not been sufficiently noted that there are decisional situations where one might say an insignificant difference is better than no difference at all. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to basically forget standard hypotheses in the way we think about that, and we're just going to say, well, we look at the empirical mean, and then if the empirical mean is positive sign, we're going to set the positive. Okay, so far we don't have any compelling justification for alpha 5% or alpha 2.5%, and there's no clear understanding of our lexicographic preference that we may have in practice about type 1 and type 2. So in 2012, Tetanov, with this Journal of Econometrics paper, came up and said, well, maybe the way we can justify this asymmetry is by including asymmetry in our min-max regret. So maybe our loss function is going to be asymmetric in the regret criterion itself. And so this is his conclusion. To obtain decision rule comparable to test at conventional level, the asymmetry factor kappa has to be much greater than the one that we've seen in the 1K loss. So it must be much greater than 39, for instance. The difference is due to the interaction between the magnitude of error and their probabilities. So for instance, if we want to motivate one-sided 5% test, then we need an asymmetry where kappa is 100. And if we want 1% test, we need kappa to be basically 1000. So this is huge asymmetry that we need. And if instead we think about standard asymmetric loss function, where for instance kappa is equal to 3, then we may want test was alpha is equal, for instance, to 34%. So much different than the 5%.
Sorry, this was for the same notion of regret you just brought down.
But yes, but asymmetric. So it's going to be an asymmetric loss function. Okay, so also using this asymmetric loss function does not seem quite compelling in terms of how we want to rationalize hypothesis testing. And so another way to think about this is to say, well, now maybe what we can do is that we can incorporate prior information in our choice of the optimal decision. So another approach to this problem is just to be completely Bayesian. And so the main issue that we've seen so far is that the expected loss function is going to be parameterized by theta. And so because it depends on theta, it's kind of unclear what's the optimal decision rule as a function of theta itself. But at the very least, what we would like to have is a decision rule which is admissible. So at the very least, what we would like to have is that if we pick a decision rule, now this decision rule is not going to be weakly dominated for all vector parameters theta and strictly dominated for some values of theta. So this is the very least requirement that we can impose on our decision. So what we could do is to say, okay, let's posit a prior on the value that theta can take, and let's just minimize the loss function once we integrate over the prior. So why is this a sensible thing to do? Well, because we know that if phi is going to be an admissible decision rule, then there's going to be a prior which motivates it. And this is the complete loss here. And so one just simple motivation to just be Bayesian. It's just that if we think that we want an admissible decision rule, then we can always find a prior. Okay, so let's think about Bayesian decision making. So again, we are in this framework where either we pay a price kappa or we pay a price 1. So there's going to be this binary loss function. And now we posit a prior on whether theta take value theta 0, theta 1 with probability pi and 1 minus pi. Now, what we can write is that now our risk function is just going to be the integral of this likelihood conditional on the value of theta 1, so under the alternative hypothesis, there's some risk scaling factor that we don't really care about for now, and then there's going to be 1 minus pi to be our prior probability. And the risk factor, if instead we take decision 1 instead of decision 0, is going to be the same, but then we're going to have also. So the optimal rule in this framework, what it's going to do is that, again, it's going to look at this ratio between the likelihood, and then it's going to compare this ratio to this 1 minus pi over kappa times pi. So now this threshold is going to be governed by the choice of the prior itself. So this is another way that you can think about making decision in this binary world.
It kind of shows nicely the symmetry between priors and loss functions, right?
Exactly.
It's the same world.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically the same. Yeah. Right. So in principle, what you could say, well, maybe I pay 1 and 1, but now the pi is gonna govern my threshold. Okay, so let's look back at the clinical trial case. So what if we are Bayesian in the way we make decisions in clinical trials? And so this paper was published recently in the Journal of Econometrics, and this is the main conclusion. So if we look at terminal illness with no existing therapies, then the standard threshold 2.5% is going to be over conservative. And the type of threshold that we want is between 20 and 30%. And the reason is because these diseases are so impactful and so deadly that we want to be less risk averse in the approval of the drug. Now, on the other hand, if we look at mild disease, then it's the opposite. So for mild disease, these are not deadly at all, and so maybe we even want to be more conservative and have a threshold of order 1.2 or 1.5%. And so this kind of also tells us that the way we want to do statistical testing must depend on benefit and cost of each test. And so we may want to have some heterogeneity, for instance, in clinical trial, depending on.
This is like calibrated on some numbers for value of life.
Yes, I'll show you. Yes. Yeah.
It's a little bit of a tangent.
Yeah, let's go.
But I just always wondered how much of these sort of FDA's implied conservatism could be justified by the fact that they're sort of playing a dynamic game where their reputation is very important, and they worry that if they're, that people will not trust their judgment in the future if they make, I always get type 1 and type, they make, type 1 or something type 2 error.
No, that's completely. So here we're not thinking about dynamics. In a few slides, I'm gonna show you a model where we have game theoretic formulation of a framework where we have a researcher with private incentive and a regulator which care about social welfare, and we're going to think about hypothesis testing, where basically you have this tension between the researcher and the regulator. But it's not exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, the tension is, of course, you have to assume that the drug company is honest and report the trial.
So there's no piacking.
If they would have the option of keeping some information from you, that would also just.
Then information. Yes.
Excellent question.
Yes. So yes, I'm gonna touch on piacking. Right, you can think about two different dimensions on which the researcher can play One is that I have private information about treatment effect because I run phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So I kind of know it. But then I'm gonna play with sample size. Because maybe if I know that the treatment effect is not that large, then maybe I want to increase noise. Because hopefully I'm gonna be lucky and get through. So that's one dimension. So I'm gonna tweak the design, I'm not gonna tweak the data. And the other dimension is, okay, I'm gonna tweak the data in the first place. This, I would say, is harder in FDA approval because there is pre-specification. But you can think about economic research with observational study. Be one example that this may happen. Yeah. So here, how do they reach this number going to max question? Okay, they assume a non-informative prior, so 50%. They also, in this construction, they pose a constraint in power being at least 90%. And then they estimate the cost as a function of benefits and side effects. So this is basically just an illustration from a table that they have in the paper. So these different diseases are ranked based on the how deadly they are in terms of the years of lifelong, something like that. So what this means is that basically if they kick in earlier, so you die earlier, then there's going to be an opportunity cost in terms of number of years that you haven't lived. And then there is a prevalence in terms of how many people will be affected by the disease, and then there is a severity. And so all of these components should enter the construction of your loss function. Okay. So one last bit of definitions. So we can define the p-value to basically be the probability of seeing a result as extreme as the one that we do see in the experiment. And this was, for instance, Fisher suggests to report as a notion of significance of our effects. But what we could do is that we can also report posterior probability of whether the null is true condition on what we do observe. And so this is what is defined as Q value. And so think about the t statistic to be drawn from two different distributions. The under the null is drawn from a given distribution of 0, under the alternative from F1, and consider a prior on whether the true hypothesis, the null hypothesis. And now you can define the Q value to be basically the probability that your null hypothesis is true, conditional on observing a result which is as extreme as the one that you just observed. Yeah.
There's of course the question, I guess we talked a little bit about that yesterday, right? Why do we have to report the binary decision at all? I mean, it's different maybe for the FDA, where you actually have to make a decision about approving the drug.
Right.
But when you write a paper, might as well just give the X bar and the reader update the beliefs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not at all clear why we want to have such a coarse summary.
I completely agree. So this is why I'm using drugs approval as the main example, because I think there you have a clear decision, either you approve or you don't approve. So that's
almost no economics papers of the form, right?
Right. Right. So once we think about publication bias, we're going to think about, okay, what if maybe I publish a paper, as your paper with Frankel would argue, maybe I publish a paper and then the audience may update a posterior belief about the parameter condition on the data.
But I mean,
yeah,
I mean, it gets to this point about communication, right? Where it seems likely that the reason to do it is that people have just a very limited capacity to retain the information.
Yeah.
And it's easy to remember has an effect or doesn't, as opposed to it's like 3.57.
Yeah, right. So So one way to think about this is to say, okay, this is almost like quote unquote a reduced form assumption on the amount of information that the policymaker can incorporate. So the policymaker is only able to incorporate binary bits of information, either approve or I don't approve, but is not able to incorporate information, more complex information, say the mean, the variance. Those exactly right. Okay, so the Q value has a tight connection to the P value because you can just invert this probability, so you can just note that the Q value is equal to the P value times this standard this component, which depends on the prior of whether you see is true. Then you scale by the marginal distribution.
Are we maintaining the assumption of monotone likelihood ratios throughout? Is that why it's T greater equal?
So here I'm just considering this threshold test, because I'm simplifying as much as I can. So the Q-value is going to be quite useful, and we're going to see one application in economics from a recent paper in QJE, where there is a direct connection between the Q-value and Bayesian decision making, because of course I can think about making decision based on cost and benefit, and then compare this cost and benefit. Okay, so taking stock from this first part, we have interpret hypothesis testing as a game against nature. We have a single decision maker, and the cost and benefit are occurring after the decision is taken. So what this means is that so far, when we think about our loss function and cost and benefit, we are not thinking about other components of this cost and benefit which may occur before the decision of running the experiment is made. So what have we missed? So something that we missed, for instance, is to incorporate the cost of running the trial in the first place. So the researcher may decide whether to run a trial or not based on the expected benefit that may receive from approval. And this cost can be huge. So this cost, if we look at phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, typically, of course, are increasing, but typically are like between 20 and 50 millions for phase 3 trials. So total cost can be quite large once we sum phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And so the researcher may say, well, there's no reason why I should run any experiment given the cost of the experiment if I know that the probability of being approved is so low. And the main problem here is that there's no direct transfer from FDA to the company. It's not that FDA can say, well, I'm going to give you some money to do this research, but what FDA can do is that I can increase the probability of rejection, and so this can be quote unquote zero transfer in this paper. So let's consider a game where we have two agents. One is the regulator, which is FDA, who can ex ante enforce statistical testing procedure, but does not know the treatment effects. And the other is the drug company, who can decide to run a pre-specified experiment after observing the regulator's choice of the statistical test. For instance, the level of significance. Now we have at this point a principal agent problem where what's really binding is going to be the rationality constraint. So the company may decide whether to run the experiment or not based on the cost. So let's consider the first scenario. Suppose first that the drug company and the regulator have aligned incentives, and the drug company knows the vector of parameters. Now, if the drug company and the regulator have aligned incentive and the drug company knows data, there's no need to do anything, not even an experiment. Just drug company, just tell me what is your treatment effect that you think it is, and I'm going to prove it or not if that's positive. That we're done, no problem. So maybe that's one way to go. So what about the other scenario? So suppose that actually the drug company has private incentive because it's going to sell the drug and make profit out of that. And so maybe now we have some misalignment both in incentive and in information. So one way to approach the problem is to say the following. Okay, let me define B phi of theta to be my welfare criterion. So this is going to be the welfare criterion of the regulator of FDA. Let me look at the worst case scenario with respect to my welfare criterion. So what's going to be my welfare criterion? Now, my welfare criterion is going to be the treatment effect theta times the probability that I rejected, so that I approved the drug. And this is going to be only true whenever an experiment has happened. If there is an experiment, then this is going to be my welfare criterion. And when there is an experiment, well, there is an experiment if that's convenient for the agent to run the experiment.
The firm only makes a binary decision about whether or not to run the experiment.
Sorry?
There's no intrinsic, no intensive margin here.
No, there's only either I run the experiment or I don't run the experiment. So there's no, for instance, choice of sample size or it's only mixed sense. And so what's the utility of the researcher to run the experiment? Well, it's going to be the probability that my drug gets approved times the price of selling the drug, so how much profit I make, and then there's going to be a cost of running the experiment. Now, what about welfare if there's no experiment? Well, then we can just stick to the baseline value that we can just define as 0. So then what's the solution to this max-min optimization problem? What do you can guess? So the max-min solution is going to be that I'm going to choose the expected value of phi, so the probability of rejection, to be less or equal than the cost of value. And so maybe this is one way to choose our threshold, and then values using data from cost and benefit for drug trials, that this should be 50%. So just to summarize some of the things that we've seen so far, hypothesis testing is difficult to rationalize in general, and in a fragmentist framework, it requires strong asymmetry. In a Bayesian framework, maybe it may motivate just reporting posterior probability of whether we believe that the null hypothesis is true or not, and in general, we want to take into account this. So this is the broad message of this person. Okay. So now let's go back to Max's point of what about publication decision? What if I just report a vector of statistics? So how do we think about decision in this framework? Okay? And so one question is, okay, but maybe what we would like to do is that we can think about this fine economic research to be, for instance, whether I decide to publish or not to publish your paper, and should we publish papers which have more surprising results in them? No. Should we move this threshold more? And so one approach to think about this problem is what Abadi suggests in his AR Insights paper. And what he argues is that actually non-significance can be more informative than significance in the limit sense. And his argument is the following: is well, if I think about a decision maker who can only incorporate binary bits of information, and so can only incorporate information if a result is significant or is not significant, now the posterior of my over my parameter conditional on the result being significant is not going to be that informative, because in the limit I always gonna reject. So it doesn't really matter. But if you tell me that it's not significant in the limit, I know that the true parameter is going to be in a very small ball. So actually, this information is going to be super new. Now, what's, however, forgetting is that, or better, what is assuming is that the audience reading the paper can only incorporate binary bits of information. So does not observe the actual mean of the reported statistics.
Well, and the other part, as we discussed.
And the other is the asymptotics.
That it's asymptotics where you assume that you're extremely high powered.
That's exactly right. So this is only true in the asymptotic region.
People can stick to 1% if you give me a billion set data points, right? So
Right.
you really adjust that.
Right. So the other thing is that if you have 1 million data points, one reason may be just because you believe that the treatment effect was super small. So one example is, for instance, what people do in these tech companies where the size of the experiment is huge, but just because the treatment effect is super small.
People make statements about a very hypothetical limit. That never occurs.
Yeah. So yes, that's right.
And moreover, if you choose sample size based on power calculations,
then it's gonna be over the bigger one.
That's killing this automatically.
Exactly. So whenever the minimum detectable effect does not grow at raised per root 10, you're really having the signal to noise ratio does not. Okay, so suppose consider another framework, and this builds a Max paper where we have some statistic X, which is drawn from some Gaussian distribution with mean theta and variance sigma square, and suppose we have a prior on our parameter, which is mean 0 and variance theta square. And now consider a different loss function. So now consider a loss function where we're gonna make a decision whether to publish or not to publish the paper. So if we publish the paper, it's gonna look at the distance between the true parameter and the posterior expectation of the parameter given the statistics. And so you can think about this posterior expectation as the quote-unquote optimal or pseudo-optimal action of an audience, which now see the vector of statistic X, and so update their beliefs. You can think to more refined choice where they also include the information about whether things are published or not, but it's just a first step. The two things around it. You can also think about having some constraints on, we cannot publish everything, so there's going to be a cost of publication. And then the last bit is that if I don't publish, now my belief is going to be, again, centered around this, it's gonna not move on my prior, and so I'm going to pay a cost which is theta minus the prior mean, so the prior mean is just here, so I'm going to just pay a cost which is proportional to the variance of the prior variance of the. So now what Franklin and Casey show is that the optimal decision is going to take some form of threshold decision rule, where the threshold is going to be particularly large, and in particular, so here this should be times, so sorry, this is times. So the threshold basically what is going to depend on is going to be the square root of the cost of publication, and it's also going to depend on the prior variance and the variance of minus. And so the idea is that if the cost of publication is larger, then I want to publish more significant results because they move the prior the most.
But also it's relative to what your prior beliefs are, right? So it's not like a null hypothesis that's like 0 or something, it's whatever the prior mean is.
Right, so it depends on the prior variance as well in this, and it also depends on sigma. So I think what's interesting of this result is that you don't have, it's not that this threshold is vanishing with sample size, because it still depends on sigma, the threshold itself. Okay, but then the follow-up question becomes, okay, but what happens if the agents are strategic in their choice? Okay, it's fine.
But it's like a height floating thing you can click.
Yeah.
In the dots. Here.
Here. You don't?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is a project which is still in progress, and this with Davide was Stanford. So suppose that we have 3 agents. We have an editor, an audience, and a researcher. And we have a state of the world where, again, our parameters drawn from some Gaussian mean zero variance eta square. And now we have a timing of the game where, well, my researcher can choose the study. So, for example, may introduce a bias and may also choose the variance of my estimate. And the way they're going to choose the study is going to maximize the chance of publication. And so the statistic now is going to be drawn with some mean theta plus a bias component beta, and then there's going to be a variance component as well, which depends on the study of the research. The editor can decide whether to publish the result, and now the audience is going to take an action, and the action is similar to what we had before. So the audience is just going to update their posterior belief about theta, condition on X. So the first goal is to maximize the audience welfare, and we're going to take into account the cost of publication.
So your audience knows beta, delta, and X delta?
No. So the action of the audience is going to be naive in the sense that condition on what the report X, the audience is just going to assume that X is unbiased. So X is going to be centered around theta 0 with variance S squared. So it knows observe S squared, but doesn't know beta. And so we can think about 2 different scenarios. One scenario where the researcher is going to choose the design, but does not observe X. So there's no p-hacking.
It's right there, but the editor is sophisticated about the bias.
So what we're gonna, yeah, that's right. So, but what we're gonna do is 2 different things. The first is basically where the editor does not observe beta, and one where the editor observes. So the first setting is where basically the researcher choose the design but does not observe X. And so the editor is gonna decide whether to publish the result based on X and delta, so based on the design, but for instance does not observe Y.
But knows that there can be a beta.
Yes, that's right. And the second one is where there is asymmetric information, and so in this case, what's going to happen is that the editor does not observe the design itself, so does not observe delta, but is going to make a decision where the researcher is going to make a decision based on X as well. So this is going to be reacting. So you can think about a framework where the researcher do observe the data from the observational study and then decide what to report. So there's going to be some selective report.
Does the audience know the model of the world as well?
No. So the audience, what it's gonna do is that it's gonna assume that X is just known centered around delta zero with variance S square. So the audience is naive. Yeah. So this is the timing of the game. So there's gonna be a design, and then there's gonna be an execution, then there's gonna be an evaluation. Finally, there is the audience action, and the audience is naive. I think I'm almost. I still have some time.
Until 11:45 if you want.
Okay. And so here are two examples. Suppose that, for instance, we have a design delta, and the design can be either an experiment or an observational study. And the researcher is going to choose delta to maximize the expected value of publishing net of the cost, and the cost is associated with each design. So, for instance, running an experiment is more costly than running an observational study. So now let's consider for simplicity a setting where there is no bias, so let's just simplify things. But the difference between the experiment and the observational study is that the experiment is just going to be more costly. Okay, so what's the optimal decision rule? So if we just have to implement an experiment, so there's no observational study in this body, the optimal decision rule is going to be the same as in Frankel implicit. And so I'm going to choose a threshold which depends on the cost of publication and then the prior variance and the variance of my history. Now, if I say I have no observational study, but now the cost, there is a cost of running the experiment, now what I want to do is that I want to adjust my threshold accordingly. Because now my threshold will not only depend on the cost of publication, but will also depend on the cost of the experiment. And the reason is because there is an individual rationality constraint.
So you just have a just high enough rejection probability to make the experiment.
I need a large enough rejection probability for the guy to actually run the experiment. And so this is going to depend on the cost of the experiment. Now, if we said that there is also a choice from the researcher whether to run the experiment or the observational study, we can think about two different regimes. And one regime is where the experiment is cheap, so the cost is below a certain threshold. Now, if the experiment is sufficiently cheap, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to basically compare the mean-square error between the observational study and the experiment. Then I'm going to try to incentivize the one with the lowest mean-square error. And intuitively, the reason is because I care about the square loss function. The experiment is sufficiently cheap so that the individual rationality constraint is not going to bind. So I only care about mean-square error. Now, on the other end, if the experiment is not cheap and so the experiment becomes expensive, now things becomes a little bit trickier. Because now this comparison will also depend on the cost of the experiment. And the intuition is that because the experiment is costly, if I want to publish things for the experiment, I need to publish less surprising results to make the individual run the experiment in the first place. And so I can push this argument to the extreme. And so I can make the experiment sufficiently costly so that I will never choose to incentivize experiments. I will always prefer observational study no matter what the domains. Now you can also think about a setting where there is asymmetric information. So for instance, the researcher can also observe X, can also observe the data from the experiment and can induce a bias. And now for simplicity, just to keep the math simple, let's suppose that there's going to be a cost of inducing a bias from the researcher. So you can think about this almost like a reputational cost. So the more the bias that I'm gonna induce, the larger is gonna be the cost that I pay. So in this framework, there's gonna be X star, so that I'm not gonna publish your experiment if X is below a certain threshold. I'm gonna publish if X is above this threshold plus 1 over the cost of hacking the experiment. And then there's gonna be a middle ground where I randomize. And so the reason why I want to randomize is because basically I want to smooth the publication decision rule. Now, another interesting feature of this result is that there's going to be in equilibrium some studies which are act. So some studies with some bias. And because for some values of these studies, then it's going to be better to do some bias rather than decrease too much the publication problem, but rather than publishing lesser percent.
So I'm not sure if I follow this. So how does the randomization help me disincentivize manipulation here?
So I'm not really disincentivizing manipulation, but basically, so what's happening is that the researcher do observe X, but I don't observe X. So for me, X is noisy. And so what's going to happen now is that
For me, is the journal, the editor.
the editor.
Yeah.
So for the editor, X is going to be noisy, but for the researcher, it's going to be observed. And so now the threshold I would just want to do some noise. So I want to randomize whenever my X is between these two values. Because even if I observe the true X, now there's going to be some probability that I publish and some probability that I don't publish. I don't know deterministically what's going on as a researcher.
Somehow that's a result of there being possibility for the researcher to add a bias that's unknown to the editor.
Sorry?
But somehow that's a consequence of the researcher being able to add a bias to the estimates that are unknown to the editor.
That's right. So the researcher is using this bias, CD times beta delta, but I don't observe how things are moving. So that's an assumption of the model. And the other assumption of the model is that, well, that's not directly related to the randomization, it's that I'm getting Is this clear?
I'll ask you offline maybe. I'm not sure I follow the mechanics.
Okay, sure.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the definition of what is an experiment, what is observation.
Oh, so far the way I define experimental observation is that experiment is a study where there's no cost, where there's a cost, and observation is a study where there's no cost practicated. And this in the first part where in the simplest possible scenario, you can think about the researcher to decide whether to run an experiment or observation study. Just for simplicity, assume that none of the two has any bias, but one of the two has a larger cost. So then the comparison is going to be about the variance between the two. And the main point is that this comparison does need to take into account not only the variance of the two, but also the cost of the experiment.
So they have fixed costs, different fixed costs.
Yes.
And different
Exactly.
variances.
Yeah, so it's super simple. Okay. So let me conclude with a short discussion about multiple hypothesis testing. And let me just mention that we may move away from the single hypothesis testing procedure, and we can think about multiple hypothesis testing when we want to consider multiple treatment subgroups or multiple outcomes. There is some underlying consensus that if I'm testing multiple hypotheses, then maybe I want to adjust inference because of that. So for instance, suppose that I have 100 true null hypotheses and I run 100 independent tests, each size 5%. Now the error of rejecting at least one false null is going to be approximately 1. And when we think about multiple hypothesis testing procedure, we can think about different notion of compound error, either family-wise error rate, either false discovery rate, and family-wise error rate define the probability of rejecting at least one true null. False discovery rate is the expected proportion of incorrectly rejected nulls, Or we can think about indexing multiple outcomes. So what some papers do is that they say, well, I'm going to take many outcomes, I'm going to aggregate this outcome into a single index, and then I'm going to just test one hypothesis on one index. So I basically circumvent the problem of multiple hypothesis testing. And so if we look at trends in economic research, we do see that between papers which have some experiment, the share of papers which are just infinite because of multiple hypothesis testing raises from 0% to 40% in the last 10 years. And then if we look at papers with some form of adjustment, we do see that there is heterogeneity with respect to which notion of compound error they use. So some use family-wise error rate, some use false discovery rate, some do indexing, some do combination. So what's the typical approach? Here I'm quoting this paper by Anderson 2008 because it's taken as almost like standard reference for correcting for multiple hypothesis testing. And this is what they do. They say we begin by limiting the total number of hypotheses being tested. And to choose, we are gonna first define a set of outcomes. Then we are gonna construct indexing between families of these outcomes. So we're gonna group these outcomes into families, and then we're gonna construct indexes. Now, because we still have multiple indexes, what we're gonna do then, we're gonna adjust inference across these indexes. Now, if we look at what FDA suggests when we have, for instance, multiple subgroups, is control of family-wise error rate. So these are basically the two different approaches that we see. So there are some challenges with multiple hypothesis testing. The first is that there is no uniformly most powerful test. So it's kind of difficult to think about what's the optimal thing to do. And so one way to do that, and this comes from Roman and Wolf, is basically to say, well, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to define some compound error, beta of delta, and now I'm going to look at the worst case power within a ball for theta greater or equal than some value epsilon. And really, what this is doing is saying, well, I'm gonna basically look at power when the parameters are gonna be positive, so outside this epsilon, and then I'm gonna look at this case. Another way is to specify a prior over the parameter. Now, another challenge is that policy implications are also often very difficult. So here I'm quoting something from a clinical trial saying the following. There's going to be there is some heterogeneity which is observed in a clinical trial, and this heterogeneity led two different regulatory agencies to different assessments. So one agency decided to approve the drug for the entire population, no matter the heterogeneity, and the other agency instead only decided to approve the drug for one of the two subpopulations. So it's kind of difficult to understand what's the decision process underlying this mechanism.
It's kind of different action space, right? In one case, it's just one binary.
Exactly. And sometimes it's unclear for the policymaker what's the action space in the first place. Yeah.
Bigger action spaces should be mechanically better in some way.
Yes, that's right. But then how do we adjust inference because of bigger action space? Because then you have incentives. Maybe I want to test more. Okay, let me just skip. These are just definition of false discovery rate and family-wise error rate, and these are some procedures to control those. This is an example of controlling family-wise error rate. So let me just skip all of this part. So I just want to mention a paper where false discovery rate enters recently in economic research, and this is a paper by Pat Klein and Kodos published in KJ. And the idea of this paper is to send resume to firms to detect discrimination. And so what they do is that they're going to build p-value for each firm. And so for each firm, there's many resume, and then they do see the probability of, so the difference in contact gaps, that is the difference in contacting people of white and black color, for instance. And then they can construct tests for each of these firms. So now they have lots of tests because they have lots of firms. And they can estimate the distribution of the p-values. So the question becomes, suppose that there is a cost of auditing a firm if this firm is discriminating. Which firm do we want to audit? And their approach is the following. They say, well, let's just look at the smallest Q value. So let's just rank this firm by their Q values. So the posterior probability that the null is true. And then let's just
Sorry,
look
the
at,
value is coming from the empirical base. or-
yes, they use an empirical based approach, that's exactly right. So they estimate this Q value, and so to estimate this Q value, really they look at the distribution of the P value, and then they have this ratio component, which is basically prior that the null is true over the management of the P value. And so for instance, they say, okay, if we look at the 23 firms with the Q value which is smaller than 5%, then we know that in expectation only one of these firms will not discriminate. And so then we can choose the threshold for the Q value relative to the cost of auditing. And this is equivalent to basically thresholding the value and looking for the threshold which depends on the prior distributions. Okay, so let me, yeah.
If they did T statistics instead of p-values, that would have more information that should be relevant, right? Or actually point estimates instead of errors, unless like standard errors are the same for all firms.
No, standard error are heterogeneous.
Presumably that should enter the decision in addition to the p-value. Decisions.
I mean, that enters the decision, and I mean, they compute the. That's a good question.
I mean, the p-value is
The
applied to
p-value,
the
yeah,
but
it just it is scaled by the standard error itself. So they just have this test statistic, and then they compute the p-value, and then the test statistic itself depends on this. But you're asking, okay, if I'm interested in the expectation of.
if I want to do optimal auditing decisions, presumably I want to use both the standard error and the estimate.
So here they are considering binary decision rules with a cost of auditing. So I think you're right. If instead you just want to look, if you're interested in the magnitude of.
No, I'm thinking even more just binary decision. I might be wrong.
I'm not sure. In the framework, they only use directly the p-value, and they relate this to decision. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm.
Like, I mean, calculate a posterior distribution of the magnitude of discrimination at a firm. Right, the posterior distribution is going to depend on your estimate.
That's right.
And it's not going to be, and don't think the p-value is a sufficient statistic for that.
Yes. So on this, I agree. Yes. So their argument, yes. So yes. So their argument is that basically they're using the reason why they're using the Q values because there is a tight connection to false discovery rate control. So they say, okay, look, the Q value is actually equivalent to false discovery rate control. But what we're going to do is that we're going to relate the notion of Q value to false discovery rate control. And actually, this relates to a binary decision problem. This was shown in story. So in this case, just looking at the Q value actually relates to variation decision. But we can talk offline. Okay, so let me conclude just mentioning that when we have multiple outcomes instead of multiple decision, things become trickier because if we have multiple outcomes, we don't really know what's the underlying decision process. So do we have a single decision and multiple objectives? Do we want to aggregate all of these outcomes into a single objective? What's the corresponding utility function? And this becomes quite unclear. And so, for instance, in economics, we've seen that the typical approach is to group these outcomes into families, and then it's kind of unclear what we mean by family of outcomes. And FDA has two different recommendations. If you look at their practice to the guide for the industry, saying that when demonstration of treatment effect, so either they require demonstration of treatment effect on all the endpoints, on all the outcomes, or they require the demonstration of treatment effect on at least one of them. But in other cases, it becomes quite unclear why you want to do separate testing and how you want to do separate testing. So for example, in the first case, just doing alpha tests can be conservative, just because you require effect on all the endpoints. And in the second case, you can just do a joint test if you just care about rejecting articles. Okay, so let me skip this part and let me just conclude. So what we have reviewed are notional multiple hypothesis testing. We have connected this to recent work in economics. We have discussed some of the decision theoretic interpretation. So what is coming next tomorrow is going to be a decision theoretic justification of different compound errors and a decision theoretic justification of one possible model of thinking about multiple hypothesis testing. So that's pretty much it. And thanks very much.
Right, we got a 1 hour break now. We meet again at 12:45. Short speakers. And this kind of nicely